At sunrise, the Forum Boreum begins to stir. Merchants unroll their ledgers, handlers test the strength of wooden platforms, and a crowd gathers with the restless energy of a marketplace where fortunes can change with the lift of a hand. A chain of captives, some silent, some trembling, waits as traders prepare them for display. One man dusts the shoulders of a young boy, positioning him so the morning light falls across his face. Another adjusts the posture of a Syrian girl, instructing her to stand straight, to breathe steadily, to look obedient. Around them, buyers inspect bodies with the same calculating gaze they use for livestock. This is a normal morning in Rome, where people are not merely present, they are for sale. Soon the announcements begin. Illiterate youth, Greek in origin, suitable for household duties. A Thracian laborer, strong, accustomed to farm work. A Syrian woman trained in music and domestic arts. Each description is a fragment of a stolen life, reduced to traits meant to attract bidders. Prices rise and fall, 1,500 denarii, 506,000 lon. Numbers shouted as though they were discussing grain shipments instead of human beings. Yet behind the brutality lies a system astonishingly organized, almost clinical in its precision. The Romans documented every sale, contracts, receipts, and written confirmations of delivery. Not of goods, but of people. These surviving documents now act as open windows into a world that otherwise might have vanished into silence. Slavery permeated Roman civilization from its earliest mythic days to the collapse of the Western Empire. But for historians trying to understand how this massive system operated, attention turns to one specific period, from the 1st century BC to the 2nd century AD. This choice is not a matter of preference. It is dictated by evidence. The Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, the colossal collection of all known Latin inscriptions, spans 17 volumes. 16 of them come from the imperial era, and roughly 90% of surviving Roman literature also belongs to this time frame. Even the most influential late Republic figures, Cicero, Caesar, Lucretius, produced their works during its opening decades. In other words, more than 90% of all information we possess about ancient Rome comes from the last 40% of its history. And equally important, this era represents the zenith of Roman slavery. After Caesar's campaigns, slave markets were overwhelmed with unprecedented numbers of captives: Gauls, Greeks, Syrians, Judeans, Iberians, brought in by the tens of thousands. Pompey's Eastern Wars created similar waves, and crucially, during this same period, Rome's economy remained relatively stable. Inflation had not yet devastated currency values, and coinage still carried predictable silver content. That combination, abundant human supply plus financial stability, makes this era historically unique. Because of this, the 250-year stretch offers historians something rare: a consistent, well-documented, economically coherent slave market. Prices were not random. Patterns emerge across inscriptions, papyri, sales contracts, and literary accounts. The Romans developed a framework, cold, rational, methodical, for assigning monetary value to human lives. And the first pillar of this system was origin. Romans held strong stereotypes about different ethnic groups, and these assumptions shaped pricing dramatically. Greeks often topped the market. They were admired, sometimes begrudgingly, for their intellect, culture, and refinement. Households sought them for roles requiring literacy or trust: tutors, secretaries, accountants, personal attendants. Their perceived docility and education meant higher prices. Gauls and Germans, by contrast, were valued for raw strength. Their towering physiques were ideal for construction, farming, mining, and military-adjacent labor. Gladiator schools paid well for them. Romans believed Gauls were fierce and sometimes rebellious, while Germans were loyal and durable, traits that influenced how traders marketed them. Syrian, Phoenician, and Judean slaves belonged to a different category. They were associated with craftsmanship, numeracy, and shrewd business instincts. Wealthy owners often purchased them to run estate operations, workshops, or trade ventures. As regions became more Romanized, learning Latin, adopting customs, stabilizing under Roman rule, the value of slaves from those areas rose. Skills and education were the second major determinant of price. The difference between an unskilled worker and a trained artisan was immense. A laborer might sell for only a few hundred denarii, but a skilled craftsman like a shoemaker, metalworker, or carpenter could be worth thousands. Pliny the Younger records a shoemaker sold for 4,000 denarii, more than a legionary earned in over a decade at 20 denarii per month. Intellectual professions commanded even higher sums. Greek grammarians, mathematicians, and philosophers were prized. Doctors, especially from Greek tradition, could cost 20,000 denarii or more. Martial speaks of a cook sold for 100,000 denarii, an extravagant luxury equal to a large country estate. Actors and performers could reach spectacular prices. The Greek performer Panurgus reportedly sold for 700,000 denarii, a sum almost unimaginable for most Romans. Age created a predictable curve in pricing. The prime range was 15 to 25. Romans believed individuals in this window possessed both strength and longevity. Children, however, presented risk. Infants and toddlers were cheap, sometimes bundled with mothers. But by age 10, their value rose sharply, and wealthy families often purchased children to raise within the household, believing such slaves became more loyal adults. After 25, prices slowly declined. At 40, value could be half what it once was. After 50, unless the individual had specialized knowledge, their price plummeted. Documents record 60-year-olds sold for as little as 100 denarii. Still, skilled professionals like physicians or teachers retained significant value well into old age because knowledge remained useful long after muscle faded. Physical traits added a further layer of evaluation. For manual laborers, strength, stamina, and visible health were key. Traders sometimes staged demonstrations, lifting stones, running short distances, to impress buyers. Scars, deformities, or chronic conditions reduced price. For household slaves, beauty mattered more. Clear skin, symmetrical features, light or exotic coloring, and graceful movement drove prices up. Some elite Romans curated visually themed households, blonde Britons, dark-skinned Ethiopians, treating enslaved people as coordinated aesthetic ensembles. Inspections were invasive, public, and humiliating. Teeth were checked, limbs manipulated, skin examined for disease. Sellers were legally required to disclose illnesses, but many concealed defects to inflate prices. Gender shaped the market in two distinct ways. Male slaves were more abundant and valued primarily for labor. Female slaves, however, were priced through a complex blend of skills, beauty, age, and reproductive potential. Wet nurses, midwives, and women trained in cosmetics commanded high prices. Young, attractive women could sell for far more than men of the same age, particularly when sexual exploitation was implicitly part of the purchase. And beyond personal traits, the broader world, wars, peace, geography, seasons, caused prices to rise and fall. Military victories could flood markets with captives, lowering prices. Peace raised them. Rome itself had the highest prices, frontiers the lowest. Seasonal demand for farm labor created predictable cycles. The patterns we saw emerging in the first part become even clearer when we examine how external forces, war, geography, and the rhythms of the Roman economy shaped the value of enslaved people across the empire. For all the personal traits that determined an individual's price, the broader landscape of Roman power often mattered just as much, sometimes even more. No single factor altered slave prices more dramatically than war. Rome's expansion was not only a political and military enterprise, but also an economic engine that fed its labor market. After every major conquest, streams of captives poured into Italy, overwhelming marketplaces from the Forum Boarium to Delos. Traders sometimes complained that after successful campaigns, prices fell so sharply that profits evaporated. Pompey's campaigns in the east generated such an influx of captives that the market temporarily destabilized. Caesar's Gallic Wars were even more extreme. Ancient sources estimate that nearly 1 million people were enslaved over the course of these campaigns. The result was simple and brutal. Supply skyrocketed, prices dropped, and enslaved individuals from these regions became, for a time, the cheapest in the empire. Periods of peace produced the opposite effect. With fewer captives entering the system, Rome increasingly relied on the internal reproduction of enslaved populations. Large estates encouraged breeding, treating enslaved women as long-term investments. The children they bore, vernae or homeborn slaves, held particular value, often considered more loyal and easier to train. By the 2nd century AD, as Rome's borders stabilized under the Pax Romana, prices rose steadily across the empire. For the first time, traders depended more on domestic births and frontier purchases than on massive waves of war captives. This shift changed not only the price of enslaved people, but also the way owners viewed them, with some becoming more protective of valuable household slaves and highly trained individuals. Geography also played a significant role. Rome, as the center of wealth and status, naturally commanded the highest prices. Buyers in the capital were often senators, knights, wealthy businessmen, and large landowners eager to display luxury. A skilled slave who might sell for 2,000 denarii in a provincial town could be worth 4,000 or more in Rome, simply because elite households competed fiercely for slaves who could enhance their prestige. By contrast, frontier regions, Germania, Pannonia, Syria, often had lower prices due to distance from major buyers and a surplus of locally captured or traded individuals. Even within the empire, regional economies shaped value. Egypt, for example, consistently showed lower slave prices in surviving papyri. Its unique agricultural system, tied closely to the Nile and managed independently for centuries, created different economic conditions. Egypt also maintained trade connections with Nubia and the Red Sea, providing alternative sources of enslaved people outside Rome's main networks. These layered systems meant that an enslaved person's value could vary drastically depending on where the sale took place, who was buying, and what regional markets demanded at the time. Seasons, too, influenced Rome's human economy. Agricultural laborers were in highest demand just before planting and harvest seasons, causing prices to spike. After harvest, when estate owners no longer needed extra hands, prices dipped sharply. Traders took advantage of these cycles by purchasing slaves in winter, when demand was low, and reselling them in spring for higher profit. This level of predictability indicates how deeply embedded slavery was in Rome's economic calendar. Labor needs, estate management, and even annual productivity were tied directly to the movements of enslaved people through commercial channels. To better understand how Romans interpreted value, we can look at documented case studies from the period. These examples illustrate the market's harsh logic in action. A young man from Gaul, strong and physically capable at 22 years old, would have been appealing to many estate owners. But suppose this man was missing 2 fingers on his right hand, an old battlefield injury perhaps. That single physical trait would significantly reduce his labor capacity and therefore his price. Traders might emphasize his resilience, his experience in farm work, or his potential usefulness in tasks not requiring full dexterity. Still, the market would likely value him at a fraction of what a fully able-bodied man of similar age would fetch. Another example might be an older Greek man, 55, fluent in Latin and Greek, and trained in philosophy or rhetoric. His age would normally be a major drawback, yet his education and intellectual training placed him in a distinct category. Wealthy households loved to display cultured tutors as status symbols, and such an individual might still sell for a respectable sum. His knowledge of language, literature, and household management would extend his usefulness far beyond that of a younger laborer. Consider also a boy from Numidia, only 11 but healthy, quick to learn, and possessing an exotic appearance by Roman standards. Although he lacked formal skills, buyers might consider him a long-term investment. Young slaves were adaptable, capable of being molded into nearly any role. His price might rise accordingly, especially among households seeking pages, attendants, or future personal servants. The Syrian girl, 17 years old, beautiful and well-trained in dancing, singing, cooking, and basic literacy, stood at the intersection of multiple high-value traits. Origin, youth, beauty, skills, temperament, all contributed to a price many times higher than an unskilled male laborer. Her features and training could cause bidding wars among elite buyers who prized charm, refinement, and household artifice. Then there is the Thracian gladiator, 28, visibly strong, but scarred from combat. Gladiator training was both a curse and a blessing in the market. On one hand, the injuries reduced his value for ordinary labor and marked him as someone who lived a life of violence. On the other, gladiatorial experience meant potential for high entertainment or specialized work as a bodyguard. His price might be unpredictable, fluctuating depending on the buyer. Finally, imagine a Germanic man, 25, powerful and well-built, but branded with the letter F on his forehead. Fugitivus, a runaway. This mark was both a legal warning and a stain on his market value. Buyers would know he attempted escape, signaling potential disobedience or risk. For these reasons, fugitive slaves often sold cheaply, sometimes only for hard labor positions where constant supervision was possible. These case studies highlight an important truth. The Roman slave market operated on a rational, transactional logic that reduced individuals to bundles of attributes: origin, age, skill, strength, fertility, appearance, temperament. Each trait pushed the price up or down, sometimes by enormous margins. But this logic only becomes meaningful when we place it into economic context. What did these numbers actually mean? Converting ancient prices into modern currency is notoriously difficult. One of the simplest methods compares the silver content of a denarius, about 4.5 grams, to modern silver prices, yielding roughly $6 per coin. But this approach ignores the purchasing power of ancient coins and the radically different economic environment of antiquity. Another method uses the cost of basic food items. Graffiti in Pompeii shows that 1 denarius could buy roughly 4 kilograms of pork or 2.5 kilos of beef or lamb. A whole chicken cost 2 denarii. These comparisons suggest a purchasing power closer to $20 or $25 per denarius. A third approach compares wages. During Augustus's reign, a Roman legionary earned about 225 denarii per year. A modern U.S. soldier earns around $46,000 annually. By that measure, a single denarius could represent nearly $200 in today's money. But grain markets suggest a lower figure. A bushel of wheat today costs around $6. In early imperial Rome, the same amount cost 2 to 4 denarii. This would place a denarius somewhere between $1.50 and $3 in grain-based purchasing power. The contradictions between these methods, yielding values between $2 and $107, prove how difficult direct conversion is. The Roman economy simply does not map cleanly onto modern systems. What truly matters is not the dollar equivalent, but the relative cost of goods within Rome itself. Understanding the true meaning of slave prices in ancient Rome becomes far clearer once we compare these amounts not to modern dollars, but to the everyday realities of Roman life itself. The numbers only gain weight when placed alongside wages, housing costs, food prices, and the broader economic rhythms that shaped how people lived and how enslaved people were bought and sold. During the reign of Augustus, a Roman legionary earned 225 denarii per year, a figure that rose to around 900 by the end of the 1st century AD due to pay reforms. This means that even a relatively inexpensive slave, say, one costing 1,000 denarii, represented more than a year's salary for a professional soldier. And soldiers were not the poorest members of society. They held steady employment, state-backed stipends, and opportunities for bonuses or land grants. For many free Romans, especially urban laborers with irregular wages, the idea of purchasing a slave was simply unimaginable. Clothing, too, consumed a significant portion of a Roman's income. A basic tunic cost between 15 and 30 denarii. Imagine setting aside a month's pay just for a single piece of clothing. Shoes, cloaks, and winter garments added further expense. Owning even one slave, therefore, meant taking on a massive economic responsibility. Not just the purchase cost, but also food, shelter, and maintenance. While elite Romans owned dozens or even hundreds, most smaller households could only afford one or two, and many free citizens owned none at all. Housing provides another useful benchmark. Renting an apartment in a Roman insula might cost between 40 and 100 denarii a year, depending on the neighborhood and the floor level. The higher the floor, the cheaper and more dangerous the rent. Even modest accommodations demanded careful planning and budgeting. Wealthier Romans looked beyond rentals to purchasing homes, and property records from Pompeii show that a modest suburban house might cost 5,000 to 20,000 denarii. These numbers reveal the staggering reality behind high-end slave prices. A skilled physician priced at 20,000 denarii cost the equivalent of an entire villa. A celebrated cook priced at 100,000 or a famous performer valued at 700,000 denarii represented wealth that only the richest elite could access. With these comparisons in mind, the scale of human commodification becomes almost overwhelming. 1,000 denarius farmhand equaled a year of military service. A 6,000 denarius young woman equaled several years of steady wages. A 20,000 denarius intellectual or physician equaled property, land, or business investments. A 70 or 100,000 denarius artisan was a symbol of luxury, prestige, and elite display, purchased not for necessity, but for status. The economic significance of enslaved people in Rome went well beyond their purchase prices. They were engines of production, sustaining industries that would collapse without them. Large estates relied on slave labor for farming, viticulture, and olive oil production. Construction projects, from aqueducts to temples to private villas, depended on teams of enslaved workers. Skilled workshops for pottery, metalwork, textiles, and glassware relied on enslaved artisans. Even Rome's financial world used enslaved accountants, secretaries, and scribes to keep transactions, loans, and legal records running smoothly. This centrality of slavery to Roman life meant that prices were not just economic figures. They were reflections of Rome's social hierarchy. Enslaved people were symbols of power. A wealthy household that owned numerous well-trained slaves signaled its superiority through their skills, obedience, and specialized functions. Even within slavery, a hierarchy existed. Household slaves outranked field laborers, educated Greeks outranked manual workers, and entertainers or cooks outranked ordinary attendants. The price of a slave was often an indicator of both their expected role and their social position in the household. Because Rome's slave society was so deeply stratified, owners constantly evaluated enslaved people not just by their monetary price, but also by their potential returns. A skilled artisan could generate income, a literate secretary could manage accounts, a trained cook could elevate a household's status at banquets, a midwife or nurse could provide essential domestic care. These individuals could repay their purchase price through years of service. High-value slaves were assets, investments expected to produce tangible benefits. But this economic logic became particularly evident during manumission, the process of freeing enslaved people. Romans freed slaves far more frequently than many other ancient societies. A master might grant freedom as a reward for loyalty, years of service, or professional usefulness. Some owners freed slaves in their wills, both as acts of patronage and as a way to secure loyalty from the freed person's descendants. Others allowed enslaved workers to purchase their own freedom using a peculium, a small fund of money or property allowed to them, even though legally it still belonged to the master. The freed person, libertus or liberta, became a Roman citizen, though with restrictions. They could not hold high office, serve in the legions, or pursue certain careers. But their children became full citizens, indistinguishable from any other Roman. This pathway made manumission a powerful incentive for enslaved individuals to specialize, remain loyal, and aspire toward education or skilled labor. It also gave owners a structured way to retire aging slaves without bearing the cost of lifelong maintenance. This system of manumission contributed to Rome's distinctive social structure, where freedmen could rise in business, finance, or trade, sometimes becoming extremely wealthy. Imperial freedmen even held substantial administrative roles within the palace, helping to manage state finances, correspondence, and court operations. Yet this upward mobility was only possible because the slave market functioned with such precision. The same system that assigned high prices to skilled slaves also encouraged their eventual freedom and integration into Roman society, albeit still under layers of obligation to their former masters. Still, the darker side of this economic logic never disappeared. For every valuable household slave or educated Greek tutor, thousands more lived and died in backbreaking labor. Agricultural estates, stone quarries, mines, mills, and construction yards. These individuals were purchased cheaply and discarded easily. Their lives were short, their labor relentless, and their stories almost entirely absent from surviving records. The same rational pricing system that elevated a prized cook or doctor also condemned countless unskilled workers to anonymous suffering. In contrast, highly trained slaves, those educated, skilled, or aesthetically prized, found themselves in a contradictory position. Their value granted them better living conditions, more stable work, and sometimes the hope of freedom. But their high price also turned them into prized possessions, intensely controlled and heavily guarded. A runaway risked severe punishment. An injury diminished their worth. Even beauty could be a burden, attracting attention that compromised safety, autonomy, and dignity. The Roman state also played a role in defining the logic of pricing. Laws required sellers to disclose certain defects or illnesses. Failure to do so could void the sale or force a refund. Enslaved people with hidden conditions, epilepsy, chronic disease, tendencies to flee, had to be marked or declared. These regulations reveal how Rome treated enslaved people not as persons, but as commodities requiring transparent documentation, much like livestock or agricultural equipment. Taken together, these economic comparisons, case studies, and legal frameworks reveal the heart of Rome's slave market, a system where human beings were transformed into assets with calculable worth. Prices reflected not only personal qualities, but the entire machinery of empire, its wars, its wealth, its hunger for labor, and its rigid hierarchy. In ancient Rome, a life could be measured in denarii, and that measure shaped the fate of millions. If the previous section showed how prices shaped the lived experiences of enslaved people, then examining the slave market itself, its structure, procedures, and daily operations, reveals just how deeply this system was woven into the fabric of Roman society. The market was not simply a place of commerce. It was a highly coordinated mechanism that supported agriculture, industry, domestic life, and even Roman identity itself. The organization of a slave sale began long before buyers gathered in the Forum Boarium or other trading centers across the empire. Enslaved individuals were transported from distant provinces in groups, sometimes marched hundreds of miles under guard. Traders often cleaned them, groomed them, fed them carefully measured diets to improve appearance, and even staged temporary training to present them as more skilled than they truly were. Young children were encouraged to appear obedient, quiet, and manageable. Attractive individuals were styled to highlight their features. Laborers were made to demonstrate strength or endurance to potential buyers. When the day of sale arrived, each enslaved person was displayed on a raised platform, the catasta, so the crowd could observe them from all angles. A placard, titulus, hung from the neck listed essential details: name, if known, origin, age, skills, languages spoken, temperament, and any declared defects or illnesses. Legally, sellers were required to disclose conditions like epilepsy, escape attempts, or criminal tendencies. Failure to do so could lead to legal disputes, refunds, or partial compensation. But traders often used vague language, careful wording, or cosmetic tricks to hide defects and maximize profits. The inspection process was harsh and humiliating. Buyers checked teeth to judge age and nutrition, pressed muscles to assess strength, examined feet for signs of long marches or labor, and scrutinized skin for scars or diseases. A buyer might even lift a child, or make a man walk or run to evaluate health. Women were subject to the same scrutiny, often with far more invasive examination depending on the buyer's intentions. The market's atmosphere was a blend of commercial excitement and human suffering. Despite the brutality, the slave trade operated with legal precision. Contracts were written on wax tablets or papyrus, specifying the price, date, and any guarantees. If a slave was sold with warranty, the seller guaranteed the accuracy of the information. If sold without warranty, the buyer assumed full risk. These distinctions created a sophisticated marketplace where legal protections applied only to purchasers, not to the enslaved. Buyers varied widely. Some were great landowners purchasing dozens for estates. Others were wealthy urban families looking for household attendants. Soldiers might pool money to purchase a slave who could cook, clean, and reduce shared burdens. Merchants bought skilled individuals, scribes, accountants, porters, to manage shops or workshops. Even smallholders might purchase one inexpensive slave to assist with farming or domestic labor. But the most elite Romans used enslaved people to project status. A senator might fill his household with Greek tutors, Syrian attendants skilled in cosmetics, Gaulish bodyguards, and Ethiopian pages chosen for their striking appearance. Banquets became stages to display a household's sophistication through enslaved musicians, dancers, and cooks known for elaborate recipes. In this sense, slaves served not only as labor, but as cultural currency. While household slaves often received better treatment, their lives were still shaped by complete dependence on their masters. They could be educated, trained, and trusted with intimate tasks, but they were never secure. A household slave might rise to become a personal secretary or estate manager, positions of remarkable responsibility, yet still face punishment or sale at a master's whim. Their worth was always measured in denarii. In contrast, enslaved laborers on farms, mines, or quarries lived under far harsher conditions. Large agricultural estates, latifundia, relied on gangs of slaves overseen by vilici, slave managers who enforced discipline and maintained productivity. Quarry and mine slaves faced the worst conditions of all. Their work was continuous, dangerous, and physically devastating. Life expectancy in mines was notoriously low. Many considered assignment to a mine equivalent to a death sentence. These slaves were cheap, and Rome treated them as expendable. Urban laborers, builders, porters, mill workers, faced constant physical strain, but occasionally had opportunities to earn small amounts of money, especially if their masters allowed them to work for wages on the side. Such wages, saved carefully, could one day buy freedom. These opportunities varied greatly depending on the master and the region. Domestic and skilled slaves occupied yet another world. In wealthier households, some were allowed to accumulate peculium, personal funds technically owned by their masters. This money could be used for purchases, gifts, or even the eventual buying of their own freedom. While not all slaves received such privileges, those who did often worked hard to maintain trust and demonstrate value. Freedom, when it came, transformed a slave into a libertus or liberta. But freedom did not sever ties with the former master. The freed person owed duties, respect, obsequium, and sometimes labor or assistance, operais, and might continue working for the same household. Freedmen often adopted their former master's family name, signaling both gratitude and continued association. Yet, despite restrictions, freedmen could engage in business, own property, and even grow wealthy. The imperial bureaucracy employed many freedmen in influential administrative roles. Some became ship owners, bankers, or workshop masters, employing slaves of their own. The presence of so many freedmen in urban life illustrates one of Rome's defining contradictions. A society that depended on slavery also enabled remarkable social mobility for a select few who emerged from its depths. Yet the threat of punishment remained ever present. The Roman legal system imposed severe penalties on enslaved people who attempted escape, resisted their masters, or caused damage. The branding of fugitives with an F on the forehead was common, permanently marking them as a flight risk and lowering their market value. Harsh punishments, including beating, shackling, or execution, served as deterrents. Rebellions were met with extreme retaliation. After Spartacus's uprising in 73 BC, 6,000 enslaved people were crucified along the Via Appia, the most brutal warning in Roman history. And yet, despite the potential for violence, the vast majority of Rome's enslaved population did not revolt. Some were too young, too isolated, or too dependent on their households. Others found hope through manumission or sought comfort in religious groups, social bonds, or the shared culture of large estates. Still others simply recognized that resistance would bring devastating consequences, not only for themselves, but for everyone around them. The emotional world of the enslaved rarely appears in written sources, but occasional glimpses survive. Some inscriptions record slaves who honored kind masters after gaining freedom. Others express gratitude for opportunities granted. But far more reveal grief, loss, and endurance. the tombstone of a child enslaved from birth, the lament of a mother separated from her son, or the brief inscription marking someone faithful even in suffering. These fragments remind us that behind the structured marketplace, the legal contracts, and the economic rationality stood millions of individuals who experienced Rome's greatness as captivity. Because Roman slavery lasted for centuries, changes in the system reflected broader shifts in the empire. As Rome transitioned from republic to empire, the scale of slavery expanded. As conquests slowed, internal reproduction and long-distance trade replaced war captives. As wealth concentrated among elites, demand for luxury household slaves grew. And as Christianity spread in later centuries, attitudes toward slavery began to change. Slowly, unevenly, but noticeably. Yet through all these changes, the fundamental logic of the market remained. A slave was priced according to age, origin, skill, beauty, and temperament. A life was measured in denarii, and Rome's society, economy, and culture balanced upon this fragile, brutal foundation. If the previous section revealed how deeply the slave market shaped Roman society, then examining the long-term consequences of this system, its social, cultural, and political impact, shows just how profoundly slavery influenced the very identity of Rome and the trajectory of the empire itself. Slavery was not a secondary institution. It was a defining one, shaping Rome's economy, its class structure, and even its moral tensions. To begin with, the scale of slavery in Rome created a society fundamentally divided by dependency. Free citizens depended on enslaved labor to sustain everything from agriculture to administration. Elite households often owned dozens, sometimes hundreds, of slaves who performed domestic tasks, managed estates, educated children, and facilitated the luxurious lifestyles of the wealthy. The existence of abundant slave labor made it unnecessary for elite Romans to engage in manual work, reinforcing the cultural idea that physical labor was beneath the dignity of the freeborn. This deepened class divisions and strengthened the aristocratic ideal of a life devoted to politics, philosophy, or leisure. Slavery also shaped urban life. Rome's population, which may have reached 1 million at its peak, relied heavily on enslaved workers to function. Bakers, millers, porters, bath attendants, cleaners, construction crews, water system maintainers, scribes, and clerks, many were enslaved. In a sense, Rome's urban infrastructure was operated by people who had no legal personhood. This created a paradoxical dynamic. The capital of the Mediterranean world, the center of law and order, was sustained by individuals who had no legal rights within that system. This reliance on enslaved labor had profound economic effects. Because slaves could be purchased as one-time investments and used for decades, wealthy landowners could undercut small, free farmers and independent craftsmen. Large latifundia staffed by slaves produced goods more cheaply than free laborers could. Over time, this contributed to the decline of small family farms, pushing many free Romans into cities in search of work. Some found employment. Many relied on state grain distributions and public entertainment, the famous bread and circuses. In this way, slavery indirectly fueled the growth of an urban poor class increasingly dependent on the state. Politically, this had consequences. The presence of a large urban population that depended on free grain made the Roman plebs a powerful force in elections. Politicians seeking office used public games, grain subsidies, and displays of generosity to win support. While slavery was not the sole cause of these political shifts, it played a substantial role in destabilizing traditional republican structures and fostering the populist dynamics that later leaders like Caesar and Augustus exploited. Culturally, Roman literature reflects both admiration and anxiety about slavery. Writers like Seneca, Plutarch, and Epictetus himself a freed slave, pondered the moral tension between owning another human being and the philosophical ideals of virtue and justice. Seneca famously reminded masters that enslaved people were humans, companions in slavery to fortune, urging them to treat slaves with compassion. Yet even these sympathetic writers accepted slavery as an inevitable institution. They questioned cruelty, but not the system itself. The household dynamic created by slavery was equally complex. Because enslaved people lived in such close proximity to their masters, cooking, teaching children, managing property, or tending to personal needs, they became deeply intertwined with family life. Some forged bonds of loyalty or affection. Others endured suspicion, hostility, or exploitation. Roman law recognized this tension, imposing strict rules on enslaved people within the household. If a master was murdered, all enslaved persons under that roof could legally be executed, regardless of evidence, under the assumption that slaves shared responsibility for preventing harm to their owner. This harsh law, shocking even to some Roman historians, reveals the constant undercurrent of fear between masters and the enslaved. Manumission, therefore, became not just a legal process, but a social tool. Masters could encourage loyalty by promising freedom. Enslaved people could hope for a future in which they no longer lived under absolute control. Freed people often became active participants in Roman business life. Many ran workshops, managed trade enterprises, or served as officials in imperial administration. Their mobility gave the Roman economy a dynamic flexibility not seen in many ancient societies. A talented freedman could rise to considerable wealth within a generation, creating a unique social class distinct from both slaves and freeborn elites. But the rise of freedmen also stirred resentment. Some aristocrats viewed successful freedmen as threats to traditional hierarchies, especially when they gained influence in the imperial court. Satirists like Juvenal mocked wealthy freedmen for their ostentatious displays of success, while others feared that reliance on freedmen in government weakened traditional aristocratic authority. Yet emperors from Claudius onward used freedmen precisely because they were loyal, skilled, and dependent on imperial favor, making them ideal for administrative roles requiring discretion and expertise. Over the centuries, as Rome expanded, stabilized, and eventually contracted, the nature of slavery evolved. During the Republic and early Empire, conquest provided a steady stream of enslaved labor. But as the empire reached its geographical limits and large-scale wars declined after the 2nd century AD, new captives became scarce. The economy adapted. Slave breeding increased, raising the value of enslaved women of childbearing age. Frontier trade networks expanded, bringing in people from outside the empire's borders: Germans, Dacians, Sarmatians, and Nubians. Prices rose, and estate owners became more protective of their enslaved labor force. Simultaneously, economic pressures and cultural changes slowly began to shift attitudes. As currency devalued and inflation rose in the 3rd century AD, maintaining large slave populations became costlier. Some landowners shifted to tenant farming systems, the early roots of medieval serfdom. Christian communities, which emphasized spiritual equality before God, encouraged more humane treatment of slaves, although they did not abolish the institution. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Christian emperors issued laws restricting the sale of slaves for prostitution, separating families, or branding fugitives. These reforms did not end slavery, but they signaled a gradual shift in moral outlook. Ultimately, the collapse of the Western Empire in the 5th century AD transformed the structure of labor. The highly organized Roman slave market disintegrated. Without constant conquest, without stable trade networks, Without the wealth of a unified empire, slavery declined as a dominant economic system. It never vanished entirely, but it yielded to a new form of servitude, medieval serfdom, in which peasants were tied to the land rather than owned outright. This transition was gradual, uneven, and complex, but it marked the end of an era in which human beings were routinely auctioned in the heart of Rome for thousands of denarii. Yet even as the slave market faded, its legacy endured. Roman law, property concepts, and social models influenced centuries of European attitudes toward labor, hierarchy, and human value. Later civilizations referenced Roman practices when justifying their own systems of bondage. And today, the surviving records, contracts, inscriptions, price lists, and accounts remain among the most detailed sources in world history on the commercialization of human lives. In the modern world, it is difficult to comprehend a system in which the worth of a person could be calculated like the price of a house, a farm animal, or a machine. Yet for Rome, this was a foundational reality. The empire's achievements, the roads, aqueducts, monuments, literature, art, and political institutions, were built in a world where millions lived and died as property. The brilliance of Roman civilization cannot be separated from the suffering that sustained it. And so, as we examine the final layers of this system, from its slow transformation in late antiquity to its echoes in later history, we are reminded that the Roman slave market was not merely an economic institution. It was a mirror of Rome itself, ambitious, efficient, hierarchical, unequal, and profoundly human in both its achievements and its cruelties. As the previous section showed how the legacy of Roman slavery extended far beyond the fall of the empire, it becomes equally important to look closely at how this system has shaped our understanding of the ancient world itself. Through the evidence that survives, the gaps that remain, and the way modern historians reconstruct a society built so profoundly on unfree labor. What we know about Roman slavery is not merely a record of the past. It is a product of the voices that survived and the countless voices that did not. Unlike many historical institutions, Roman slavery left behind an unusually rich body of documentation. Sales contracts, burial inscriptions, property records, financial accounts, legal texts, and even casual graffiti provide detailed insight into how enslaved people were bought, sold, and managed. Yet this abundance of written material comes with a significant limitation. Nearly all of it was produced by those who owned slaves, not by the enslaved themselves. The system that defined millions of lives left almost no first-person testimonies from its victims. Their experiences must be reconstructed indirectly, from prices, punishments, job assignments, household roles, and the rare glimpses preserved in epitaphs or moral reflections. One of the most valuable sources is the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, a monumental collection of inscriptions found throughout the empire. These inscriptions, carved into stone by masters, freed people, and occasionally slaves themselves, preserve names, ages, occupations, and relationships. Many reveal strong emotional bonds within enslaved or freed communities. Husbands and wives naming each other with affection, parents mourning children, friends commemorating shared hardships. These inscriptions show that enslaved individuals formed enduring personal connections, despite a system designed to deny them autonomy. Other inscriptions reveal harsh realities, records of branding, escape, punishment, or sale. Some mention slaves born in the household, while others identify a person as taken in war, from Syria, from Gaul, or purchased without warranty, allowing historians to track geographic origins and trading patterns. Together, these fragments create a mosaic of lives marked by displacement and adaptation. Literary sources also contribute, though they reflect elite perspectives. Writers like Varro, Columella, and Cato discussed slavery in practical terms: how to manage estates, discipline laborers, and maximize production. Philosophers like Seneca grappled with the moral dimension of owning human beings, but ultimately treated slavery as an embedded institution. Satirists such as Juvenal depicted slaves as status symbols or comic characters, reinforcing stereotypes rather than challenging them. Yet these sources, despite their biases, help reconstruct the roles enslaved people played in daily Roman life. Legal texts offer an even clearer window into the structure of the slave system. Roman law defined enslaved people as property, res, devoid of personal rights, yet paradoxically capable of holding responsibilities. They could be punished, held accountable for offenses, or forced to testify under torture. Masters possessed the legal right to discipline them, though extreme cruelty was occasionally condemned by moralists or restricted by imperial edicts. Laws regarding manumission reveal the mechanisms through which enslaved people might gain freedom and citizenship, along with the obligations owed to former masters. These laws show how slavery, rather than being a monolithic institution, operated within a complex legal and social framework. Another valuable source is papyri from Egypt, which preserve contracts, letters, and business records on materials that rarely survived elsewhere. These documents reveal everyday transactions: the hiring out of enslaved workers, medical treatments for enslaved children, disputes over ownership, and instructions for training or clothing. They provide details about prices, job assignments, living conditions, and the economic integration of enslaved labor into regional markets. Through papyri, historians can trace the lives of individuals otherwise lost to history. Archaeological evidence complements these textual sources. Artifacts such as shackles, slave tags, domestic tools, and simple clothing reveal material aspects of enslavement. Remains of rural estates show the organization of slave quarters, workshop spaces, and agricultural infrastructure. Urban excavations uncover multi-story insula where enslaved domestic workers slept in tiny rooms or storage spaces. Graffiti in Pompeii and Herculaneum shows jokes, insults, or casual references to slaves, small details that humanize the anonymous masses. In villas, the presence of luxurious dining rooms decorated with intricate mosaics stands in stark contrast to the cramped quarters where servants lived and worked. Yet even with this wealth of evidence, vast gaps remain. We know very little about the inner thoughts, dreams, fears, or emotional lives of the millions who passed through Roman markets. Most enslaved people left no written record and were buried without inscriptions. Their voices must be imagined through the structures that contained them: labor systems, punishments, prices, and laws. This silence is one of the most haunting aspects of studying Roman slavery. It forces us to confront the reality that the empire's achievements, so celebrated in history, rested on the suffering of countless people who were denied the opportunity to tell their own stories. The modern study of Roman slavery has undergone significant shifts. Early historians focused on legal structures and economic functions, often underplaying the human cost. In the 20th century, scholars began examining slavery from social and psychological perspectives, drawing from anthropology and comparative history. Recent research emphasizes individual experiences, dignity, agency, and resistance, both subtle and overt. Microhistories of estates, households, and provincial communities reveal a complex picture. Slaves who endured harsh conditions, slaves who formed families, slaves who negotiated privileges, and slaves who found paths to freedom. Modern perspectives also examine resistance. Large-scale uprisings like Spartacus's rebellion are well known, But everyday acts of defiance, slow work, sabotage, escape attempts, forming secret networks, were far more common. Court records describe cases of theft, flight, or violence committed by enslaved individuals, revealing a constant undercurrent of tension. While rebellions rarely succeeded, they underscored the instability of a system built on coercion. Religious change played a role as well. Early Christianity, though not immediately abolitionist, introduced new ideas of equality before God, moral obligations to treat slaves humanely, and spiritual brotherhood between master and slave. Over centuries, these ideas influenced imperial policies, leading to reforms that restricted abuses, prohibited extreme punishments, and gradually altered social attitudes. Christianity did not end slavery in Rome, but it sowed seeds that later civilizations expanded into broader critiques of bondage. Today, historians continue to debate the extent, impact, and moral dimensions of Roman slavery. What remains clear is that slavery was not merely an accessory to Roman greatness, it was foundational. The empire's economy, culture, infrastructure, and political stability depended on enslaved labor. Without slaves, Rome as we know it would not have existed. Yet the legacy of Roman slavery is not simply a story of exploitation. It is also a story of resilience. The inscriptions left by freedmen, the accomplishments of former slaves who rose to wealth, the survival of communities despite oppression, all reveal human endurance in the face of overwhelming power. These stories remind us that even within systems designed to strip people of agency, individuals found ways to assert identity, build relationships, and pursue hope. As we draw together all the threads of this complex institution, its markets, prices, legal systems, daily realities, personal stories, and long-term consequences, we gain a deeper understanding not only of ancient Rome, but of humanity itself. The Roman slave market was a machine of astonishing efficiency and profound cruelty. It shaped the empire's rise and influenced centuries of societies that followed. And through the surviving fragments of its world, we confront both the brilliance and the brutality of a civilization that continues to fascinate and warn us today.